radio was a friend of mine. Because on the radio there were programs for children in the 1940s. There was a program every weekday at 5:30 called Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, brought to you by Wheaties, Breakfast of Champions.
Please welcome Richard Pearce.
Thank you. Thank you, Enid. And you'll see a picture later on in the slideshow of Enid and her brother Danny Cuthbert and myself, all in the same room at Royal Oak School. When Enid asked me to share some reflections growing up on the observatory, she said, we would like you to tell us what it was like from your point of view when you were 4, 5, and 6. And I've endeavored to do that. I really don't know why you might be interested in some of those aspects of it. And I found myself slipping into more of a historical presentation on Prospect Lake, where I went to school, and so on and so forth. And I was advised that that's not the purpose of tonight, and you're far more knowledgeable than I am in some aspects of Prospect Lake, and certainly more than I am about Royal Oak, even though I was here for a period of time. So I would like to, just before getting going, I'd like to give credit to a number of people who, without whom I wouldn't be wanting to do this. And I think it arose originally with Enid, as many things do. I attended her August gatherings that some of you have been at. And through that, met a number of you. And then there was the opening of the Royal Oak Annex 2 years ago, or so. And Daryl and Enid were there, and we talked. And Daryl had a dream, and he shared that a little. And so the Royal Oak Historical Association informally developed to record oral histories, of which I think we are singularly indebted to this person for having taken that on. Yeah. So I don't know any other historical group who has that legacy now with those oral histories. Some of your relatives are on there, some of you are on there. Before the Royal Oak situation occurred, I met Audrey Barnes, who is here tonight, Winona Pugh, whose husband? Relative?
Not a relative.
Not a relative.
No.
Same last name?
Same last name.
Oh, there's a story. Okay. And Laurie James Derry. And 5 or 6 women, but I think mainly Winona and Audrey and Laurie, worked at producing a book that I'm sure you've all seen, and if you haven't, it's a great joy to read. Because it gives a perspective on Prospect Lake, which, when I lived on the hill, from, and it's hard to see on here, 1940 to 1951, I came in at about the 7th inning in the ball game. In other words, the Prospect Lake developed in the 1890s or so as a resort area, as you probably know, for fishermen and summer camping and hunting. And the electric railroad that ran out to Deep Cove, which still exists today, was thought to be the destination, and it developed. So my recollection is limited. But when I read this and started to look back at aspects of Prospect Lake, which you'll see on my slideshow, I found, which I don't have in my own archives, I found a very fine 1947 picture of Prospect Lake School, built and designed in the same architectural fashion as the Royal Oak School was and as many other schools were during this time, as some of you studied. And I also found, and I remember this, on the observatory, I got a lift up the hill one day from a gentleman who drove an amazingly teardrop-shaped car. And it was Barney Oldfield, or Basil. And he had been down to San Francisco and had met Howard Hughes and had learned Howard Hughes's rather secretive government project of countersinking rivets into the surface for airplanes and to allow them to be more aerodynamically efficient. And Howard gave Barney the technique for countersinking these rivets, and that's what he did with his car. And I remember him driving me up to the observatory on this, and I sat on sort of the transom between where the driver was and sort of crouched, and he took me up, and that was singular. So there's some marvelous pictures in here which brought back memories, so I wanted to give credit to that. And to Heather Smith, who provided me with some insights and a great picture that you'll see later on in here. And Ann Allen, who is a photo archivist in the Prospect Lake area, has an enormous studio with volumes of historical pictures. And she took all of my pictures and put them in sequences for me, also for another project. And Peter Goddard gave me a couple of pictures that I'm using. And mentioned in the program are those individuals that I knew as a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old boy: Douglas Rose, Douglas Gate, Brant Sheldrick, and eventually Enid and Danny Cuthbert. So, Darrell says, if you make a mistake or you flub up, just pause, because he'll edit all that out.
Or not.
Or not. Yeah, that's right. So we're looking northwest in that photo, and you can recognize, obviously, the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory. And you'll see on the left-hand side of the photo the West Saanich Road that proceeds along there. And then you'll see some fields not far from where the Red Barn is at this point, and then out toward Heel's rifle range, and eventually out to the area where Bouchard's Gardens is. And there's Brentwood Bay, and you can see the island stretching to the left. So that's looking northwest, and you'll notice that in the hill there's a very dense forest on the northeast side and also on the south side, but on the southeast side there's a lot of barren rock, and many years ago that was one of the fires that burned off part of the property of the observatory during the 1940s when I was there. This is all a modern complex now, and there are many federal departments that are operating there with geophysics and earth sciences, as well as some of the astronomical work. And this is a tower here which is used to what's called figure and configure mirrors to a particular specification, and a number of other buildings. And this is the new office building that surrounds, you can see a red roof structure there. That's the old office building, and so they built this new structure around it instead of destroying the old one. They have two buildings now. And here's the dome, and that's where the director's residence was. That's where I lived for those 11 years. And the road, 1.5 miles down to West Saanich Road. Okay, so let's have a look here. If we look southeast, you can see the observatory hill, and then you can see Elk Lake. And behind Elk Lake is Mount Douglas, and then over to the right, a little obliterated by the photo, is Mount Tommy. There on the right-hand side is the burned off part of the hill. It was so severe that the government enlisted the support of a platoon of Army men who lived on the hill and in encampment for a week in trying to keep ahead of any of the other fires. And I never learned whether they were set on purpose. It happened to be a very warm set of months in the summer when this occurred, but it certainly threatened the observatory, as you can imagine. And there is, again, all of the no timber here on the side. You can, some of you car gentlemen can probably tell what year that car was, but that's about a 1940 or so shot. And on the left is the director's residence, and my backyard, excuse me, Daryl, my backyard was here. That's the water tower that you were forbidden to climb up, but I put my initials on the top of it several times. And I was such a fool because the ladders to go up here were crisscrossed metal, and you put your feet within these metal things and nothing to hang on to but this. And, you know, fools. This is the garage, and then the engineer's house was there. He was the instrument maker. He was the only other living being on the hill on a 24-hour basis other than my family who lived there. And this is the office building down here. And it's important that you sort of have a little background of this because my life had 450 acres of forest, which I became fairly intimately connected with, both flora and fauna during the years, and a backyard here, which eventually had a playhouse and a few other things. That's what the fire left at the bottom of the hill. So you can see the scarring of the trees and how barren it is. And those are the original gates and so on. If you go out today, about 3 weeks ago, Sylvia and I drove out West Sandage Road and we took a few shots. The gates are gone. There's a little podium a little further up the road, and on the left-hand side there's some fences. And it's rather uninteresting at the base. There's some tanks of probably fluid or propane or water tanks at the bottom, and there's some work going on. I have no idea what's going on. I haven't been down on the hill for this. But there is the beginning of a trail which goes up to the top of the observatory by the office building. This trail was actually built by the Army, who was there because they needed to get up and down and go through the forest and so on. And I used that trail every day I went to school, coming down the hill on that trail, catching the West Sandage bus when I went backwards and forwards. So, and when I came home from Prospect Lake School or Royal Lake School, I started at that trail. Now, in 1947, my father, we lost our mother when I was 9 in 1945, and he married a wonderful woman in 1947, an alpine climber, 17 years younger than he was. He was in his mid-50s, and he was climbing Mount Rainier one day, and because he participated in the Alpine Club of Canada, and he was on Mount Rainier and Mount Baker, and he was at the top of the hill, and the story he tells me is that he had far too much to carry, and he was out of breath, and he was in not very good shape. And up the hill comes this woman striding along, and she asked him how he was, and from her pack she took an orange, and she gave him that orange, and he married her a year and a half later. She was a bacteriologist in the after the Second World War in Vancouver, head of the lab there provincially, a fine alpinist, a good botanist, and she taught me from the age of 10 or 12, she taught me many, many, many things. How to shuck oysters, how to eat off the beach, how to be able to take a bee sting out of yourself, how to wash your clothes, all the things that a kid would need to have when eventually he leaves home. So that's the observatory part of it. Now, because of the fires, we had a pump on the top of the hill, and there you'll see like a fire hose, and it was always connected for months and months afterwards. And here are some of the workmen with this hose, and you can see it's fairly powerful spray from that. And there's a car on the left-hand side in the shadows. You can just see the headlights parked under there, and I have no idea what that was. But here is the federal government's pride and joy. This is the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory. There was an observatory being built in Ottawa at that time, a 72-inch, just like this one. But this observatory was placed in Victoria for 3 reasons. The climate throughout the year was very moderate, so the engineering grease and oil and gears could work in winter and summer. Very seldom ever froze. Secondly, the skies were very clear. There was lots of good weather in those days, and there was very little light from Victoria. It was a town, at the time it was done, of about 40,000 people, and then 60,000 people and so on. So there was not much city light. Since then, all those things have, of course, deteriorated. The instrument maker, Mr. Sidney Girling, is on the right. He was a kindly gentleman who made me a U-bow, and we went catfishing. He took me to Beaver Lake. And on the south side of Beaver Lake, if you go up the west side from the south where the old reservoirs were and the ponds, you can go up there. There's a set of rocks, and we used to go and fish off the rocks. So he would cut a piece of spirea and put a string on it, and then put a little float so that the float would sit in the water, and then down below would be the hook. And of course, when the catfish took the bait, the float would sink. And that was the time you had to strike fish to get the hook in. So we used to take home anywhere from a dozen to 20 catfish, and he used them in his garden. And he grew the most wonderful carrots. And I learned about recycling. We caught the occasional sunfish, but he was like an uncle, because my father was very busy, and Mr. Girling got married and had a wonderful Mrs. Girling, English, wonderful lady. And the Girling family was known in Victoria, and you probably know some of the Girling situations, which I have long forgotten. Andrew McKellar was one of the directors of the observatory later on. He was on that. Now, the war was on. There was a threat from Japan, and the government thought they should camouflage the observatory. So I don't know how many of you have ever seen the observatory, which is artistically painted, has scaffolding all the way around. You could see it for miles. Yes. And that was the time when, some of you may remember, we had air raid wardens in neighborhoods. How many of you? Yeah, right. And my father was one in Victoria, and there was a helmet, and it said Air Raid Warden, Air WR, or something like that, W. And we had to close our curtains at night for the light. And those of you with cars, do you remember? There was a black paper disc that went on the headlight, except for a slit that was there and poked it down. Those are the days when there was ration books. My mother had a ration book, and she also she shopped at Spencer's, which turned into Eaton's, and she had at Spencer's an account, which meant that she could go in and order food, and they wrote it all up, and at the end of the month you paid. And she had what's called a coin number. Does anyone know what a coin number was? It's the number of your account, but it's on a small metal oval disc. And her number was 8417, and I have the disc. And it was where you could get chocolate malts in the basement of the... Do you remember that? And there was a causeway between the streets that was tiled near the meat counter and so on. A chocolate malt. I must have gone to heaven 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 times having one of those. It was just marvelous. The minister didn't think much of my choice. My father not only directed the observatory, but he had a great respect for physical work. And these are the workmen. Joe Doby, with a metal leg, sitting there with a great grin in the front. Harry Dukeman, who built a lot of our pools and did a lot of plumbing and hydro work with water. Mr. Chatters at the back, he was an English gentleman, he was the custodian. of the office building, Charlie Sansbury at the back there, and he had a trucking company eventually that was on Blenkinsop, and then Roy Bennett and my dad. So he would invite them to come maybe once in the summer every month and have an afternoon. And those are the men that were very kind to me, and I'm grateful for that. Now, in addition to the workmen, there were astronomers and their wives, and in those days it was a 9-mile drive from Victoria, and therefore coming out to the hill, you came out in the day, carpooled it, then you went home at 5 o'clock, except for the director who stayed at the director's residence, and my father. So here are a number of the people. At this time, here is Richard with his Cub Scout. And we're going to see Peter's father a little later on as the Cub Master. And my sister, who was 17 years older than I was, so here she is here now in her mid-20s. She was at the University of Washington. Then she went on to other academic work. She only came home in the summers. I didn't know her really as a sibling at all. She was somebody like an aunt that came home and looked after things. And my father, and I'll just want to give a little mention. The observatory was built for the reasons that I mentioned, but the work that the observatory was doing was on the forefront of astronomical knowledge at this time. And a man by the name of Hubble in California had in the 1920s clarified that there were large nebulous areas in the sky that were not within our galaxy, but were located way away because of a certain technique which we learned. And the idea was that the ones that they could see, like Andromeda, had the appearance that there was motion in the galaxy. So the question was, did our galaxy rotate? Did it have a motion as a spiral galaxy? There's a whole classification of galaxies, and we are a spiral. The work at the observatory was to try to determine whether that was the case. So basically, what you do is you pick a whole group of different stars, and you take the light from the star, which you put into what's called a diffraction grating, into a spectrum, and you look at the wavelengths. And that will tell you whether the star is moving away from you, like a redshift eventually, or whether it's approaching you. So then you make a three-dimensional map of all of this over a period of time. It takes months to get this kind of data from one star. And that micrometer is like a microscope, but that measures very carefully the information you need. So my father, coming from Ontario, and you'll see it in a moment, he went to work at the Mount Wilson Observatory, where Hodge and Hoyle and a number of other astronomers were, and gained that knowledge, and Canada then appointed him to Victoria here. So he led the astronomy for this. And in about 1928, under Dr. Plaskett, who was the original director, they determined that the galaxy did have a rotation of about 235 million years it takes to go around. And that was a major thing. My father was given that credit with other people at the observatory. And eventually he became president of not only the Royal Astronomical Society, but he became president of the Royal Society of Canada during the years of 46 and 47. So he had a wonderful career. So here is my dad back in Ottawa in about 1920 with my sister, who was 3, and my mother, Esther Edith Mott, the daughter of a country doctor from Mount Pleasant, Ontario. And this trio then moved west to California for 2 years. He finished his work, the PhD was done and everything, and then he was appointed to Victoria. Here is my father and mother in 1940 with my sister now growing up at the University of Washington, and with Richard here at 3 1/2. So you see there's a sort of reflection of, and so my father and mother lived at 53 Wellington Avenue in Victoria, just off Dallas Road. And when my father was appointed the director of the observatory, we moved to the Hill. That's when we came out to Royal Oak in 1940. So and that wasn't our dog, that was a collie up the street that my sister just was very in love with all the time, but it wasn't ours. And so I moved not knowing what was ahead. I was taken from Wellington Avenue to the director's residence on a 752-foot mountain, Observatory Hill. And these are big California redwoods. And I can tell you that I climbed each of them, and I can tell you that it's even worse trying to see out at the top because it's denser than it is at the bottom. And it's easy to climb. There's nice branches and so on and so forth. Again, strictly forbidden. Okay. But if you remember, there were winters. And we still had to go up and down the hill. So I remember one night, my dad was at a meeting in town, and it was after Elizabeth came to live with us, Betty. I must have been 14, and they picked me up from, I think I was at Scouts that night with Mr. Goddard, and they picked me up, and we couldn't get the car up the hill. So we had to park the car at the base of the hill, and there was all the snow. And Betty, without any second thoughts, walked the 1.5 miles up with 16 inches of snow in open-toed shoes. And when we got to the top, we had hot chocolate, and it was a wonderful thing. We thought we'd climb Mount Everest, you know. And so those are some memories that I had of the winter. Well, here is Richard just before he's going to, he's probably in grade 1, but on the hill, he's surrounded by adults. There's no socialization, no children whatsoever, and school was quite a different experience for me. So there's the dome in the background, and I don't have to tell you who's in there, mother and father and a visiting astronomer and her daughter, and Mr. Welburn, who ran the Deer Home McMillan Blodell sawmill in Deer Home up in, he was a great friend. They were both stamp collectors in their avocational stuff. So here we are at Prospect Lake, and this is Division 2, Prospect Lake, and this is the spring of 1943. I was homeschooled for 6 months because my birthday's in February and they wouldn't let me go to school. In September I had to wait, and so on. And so I don't know, today I can't recognize anyone that's in that picture, but maybe some of you can. And Daryl, I think you have a copy of that. If you don't, I have the original, but I think.
And which one is you?
And here am I. Now, you look at the pinafore, the short pants, and we'll go back to there, okay? I was driven to school in a Terraplane Hudson in the morning, and I was picked up after school with the same car. I did not play well. I didn't know how to do that. I wasn't from the farm communities, nor did I walk home with them and do the natural kinds of things that you do when you grow up. So that was indeed an unusual and difficult adjustment for me. Here's grade 2. And anybody in that picture, grade 2?
Yeah. I can see it, Richard and Doug Rose right next to you, and Ted Bolton.
Good. So,
Ronnie.
so Doug, here am I. This is.
That's Doug Rose.
That's Dougie Rose. And I talked to him just a week ago, and he and his wife's name is Celia. Her name was Sylvia Bird. Now it's
Yeah.
Rose, right? So that's Dougie Rose and
Ted Bolton.
Ted Bolton.
Ron McCullough.
So there's Dougie Rose, Douglas Rose on my left.
Yeah.
Douglas
Yeah.
Rose lived in 4 different homes around the base of the Observatory Hill during the time I was, before I was there, after I was there. And they lived in one house which was at the base of the hill. That property was where there was a pump house that pumped water from one of the streams near Interurban up the hill to the top of the reservoirs where you saw the water tower. So Douglas Rose is one of the first people, boys, chums, who walked up the hill. And Doug Gate lived on the east side. The Boltons, the three of them, lived next door. And I think the Boltons might have had some sheep at one time. I may not.
Yeah,
Yeah. And so Ted, Lauren, and Elaine, and Doug. And those are my only memories of peers that came up and down. And it wasn't many times, but it happened a couple times. And Douglas Rose, their family, if he was here, I know he would allow me to tell you this, but the family struggled with livelihood, and there was a family by the name of Weldon who had a home in Victoria off of Quadra Street School by Caledonia. Okay? And I think the Palm Dairies used to be very close to Quadra and Caledonia in the old days. And I went in to visit the Weldons and to see Dougie. And I stayed overnight in their home there and so on. And I sensed that my home, with what you will see, was very different than Dougie's. And I was struck by that. We never talked about it. Kids don't sort of do that, I guess. But in retrospect, I did. And I will tell you personally that when I went to Shawnigan Lake School and we were taught how to say prayers in the Anglican Church, I was in the choir and so on, and when the bishop or somebody would be going on, telling stories that you had to try to understand the metaphor, which I did later, but not then, I would say to myself, well, I better have some prayers. And so the Roses were one of the 6 families in my prayers since I was 10 years old. So they've always been there. And the Roses and the Weldons, because they looked after the Roses. So isn't it strange how you pick things up from the past and you hold them dear, and you just believe, that they were doing some good.